All right, so good morning again, everyone. Welcome. Uh, Welcome to our webinar today on neurodiversity at school, collaboration strategies for high school families. We are so happy to welcome back our neurodiversity specialist for FCPS, Kristen Hayner. And so I'm going to turn it right over to her and let her get started. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you all for joining us this morning. And for anyone that's watching this recording, I really appreciate you being here. And so let's get started. As Mary Beth said, I'm Kristen. I am the neurodiversity specialist with the privilege of being on the equity and cultural responsiveness team in Fairfax County Public Schools. This is a brand new position. It started just last year. And this role really engages all of our community members that we see here or stakeholders that make up the Fairfax County Public Schools community, and to really center us around neurodiversity affirming mindsets and practices. And I was a high school teacher for almost 10 years. And so this morning's topic is really close to home. And as you see here, as an individual supporting all of these different entities of Fairfax County Public Schools, while I'm not able to support individual student cases, I am able to facilitate learning and conversations and putting neurodiversity affirming mindsets and practices at the forefront of what we do. Just setting a timer so I can stay on pace. And I want to encourage and reiterate one of our most incredible resources here in Fairfax County Public Schools, which is the Family Resource Center. I highly encourage you to utilize their expertise and their support. And this presentation today would not have been possible without them as thought partners. Our focus for this webinar is going to be around what can families or caregivers or parents do in their own sphere of influence to create positive partnerships with students and schools. So I really want to name here that while schools are on the other end of this partnership, during this webinar, we are only going to be focusing on strategies from that parent, family, caregiver perspective. There also is a great deal of expertise in this room with us today, and I want to honor and encourage your participation, whether it's in the chat to support this work, as I'm constantly learning not only from literature and research articles, podcasts, other platforms, but most importantly, the lived experiences of our students, our families, and our staff. So please feel free in the chat to share resources, your ideas, and your experiences so we can move together as a collective community. So the hope or the objectives of our time together is to really cultivate an understanding and appreciation for what is neurodiversity, and to consider 8 strategies that you might use to help create those positive partnerships for your student. And that can be transitioning from middle school to high school. It could be transitioning between high school grades, and how can we always incorporate relationship building. I'm going to offer these as our webinar working agreements. We are really here to start or continue and ensure that these conversations around neurodivergent experiences are included and understood and respected. And I am asking that you engage with these working agreements to create a space where everyone feels encouraged and safe to participate in any way that they are able. We're going to start off with a welcoming inclusion. I know that this can also be a very heavy topic and a stressful topic of all that comes with transitioning to high school and or navigating the high school world. And so when we are in stressful states, whether we go into flight, freeze, or fawn, our brain is really not able to receive new information and process because of what that stress does to our brain. So I just want to give us an opportunity to hopefully alleviate some of that with giving us an opportunity for choice or voice. And so if you would like to, in the chat, you can choose A, B, C, or D, which image best represents, maybe not in totality, but best represents your journey either to high school with your student and or in high school in general. And to allow for that voice, you're also welcome to elaborate in the chat if you want to give more context and understanding to the letter that you chose. I see a nice
lot of C's.
lot. I gotta, the C image always makes, the C one always makes me laugh. I feel like there can be so much meaning behind each of these images. Oh, that's interesting what your student is versus what you might be represented by. That's great. I'm going to give you just another minute to either respond in the chat or maybe writing down your answer in front of you. Or maybe if you're with someone in this webinar, you can turn and have a conversation with them. Okay. Great. I am going to close my chat now and allow for the amazing Family Resource Center team to monitor the chat. I know myself, and if I have that chat window up, I will struggle with regulating my attention. And so thank you to the FRC team for monitoring that for me from here on out. We are going to spend less than 10 minutes doing a neurodiversity review to briefly ground ourselves with a common understanding of what is neurodiversity and some of the associated terminology. If this is your first time with the neurodiversity terminology or language, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And if you would like a more in-depth dive into that language and terminology, please check out the Introduction to Neurodiversity video that is on the Family Resource Center's YouTube page. So here we have a visualization of some of the terms that we're going to be focusing on today. And so you see neurodiversity at the top. Neurodiversity is a natural and essential part of human diversity. Neurodiversity is a biological fact, and it is also a perspective. So just like with any other aspect of human diversity, being that there is no one right or correct way of being, the neurodiversity paradigm is the perspective that there is no one correct, right, or normal style of neurocognitive functioning, meaning neurocognitive functioning speaking to thinking and interacting with the world, which often relates to behavior or communication, but really getting at that thinking and that processing. And so everyone's thinking is as unique as their thumbprint because of all of the different experiences that we have as human beings that shape how our brains are wired and how we think and how we interact with the world. And this diversity of thought is necessary and essential for a sustaining and thriving environment. So neurodiversity has always existed for as long as human beings have existed. It's now that we just have a common language and terminology to communicate around the different ways of thinking and the strengths and abilities that each person has. So we can think of this as the human spectrum of thinking and interacting with the world, whether it be through behavior and or communication. We also see below that within neurodiversity, we have two subcategories, and these subcategories came from the neurodiversity community. And there are ways in which we can communicate around different ways of operating that is not attached to a value system or a worth system. They are not better, not worse. they are different ways of operating. And so with neurotypical, neuro meaning cognition, which relates to thinking and processing and perception, typical meaning most commonly occurring. So there are ways of neurocognitive functioning that are most commonly occurring within human communities, and divergent meaning starting from a common point and moving in a different direction. Again, not better, not worse, a different direction. And so with neurodivergence, which we'll touch on briefly, is the difference with neurocognitive development and or neurocognitive functioning. So there are different ways of thinking and perceiving and processing and experiencing the world. So what might be some examples of that neurodivergence? What if my brain diverges from that typical cognitive functioning? And so here we have a generalized umbrella of neurodivergence. This is not an exhaustive list. These are some examples of neurodivergences that either you might have experience with, you might hold some of these identities, and or this might be your first time interacting with these terminologies. An individual might have 1, 2, 7 neurodivergences. The term neurodivergence, while it's not a medical term, it is a way that we can communicate around different diagnoses that relate to these different ways of operating, and we don't get locked into a label. It's a way to identify differences and not live there. How can we identify these different ways of operating, how that manifests for that individual or how that presents for that individual, and see all of the different strengths that that individual comes with that we can identify and nurture to either leverage to support things that we might be challenged with and or to continue to build up as a whole individual. So wanted to just give a little bit more general understanding around these neurodivergences and how they might come to be. And so they might be due to natural genetic neurological variations. They could be to environmental neurological variations, and they can be a combination of both. And so I wanted to give just some personal examples of to really bring in some context and explanation or application, I guess it's a better word. So I'm going to share, like I said, my neurodivergences. And so I learned last year that I have ADHD, and there's a lot as to why I had a late diagnosis. We can later talk about the gender bias and the ageism that relates into research, and that we are still learning so much around these different neurodivergences. But with ADHD, that's a natural genetic variation. And so there are parts of my brain structure that operate differently, which include my electrical signals and my chemical signals. And again, it's not better or worse. It just shapes how I think and process and experience the world. It does not make me less than. It makes me who I am and how I operate. So that was a genetic example. A second example is genetic and environmental. And so a lot of times we see co-occurrences with ADHD and mental health conditions. And so I have a generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and major depressive disorder. And while I might be primed for some of those different ways of being due to genetics, there also were some environmental factors. And I also have to wonder, did my late diagnosis have anything to do with that? It's just something that I'm always thinking about. How that relates to this image here is that it really impacts the frequency, duration, and intensity of the chemical signals in my brain, and really how much I have at any given time that impacts how I think, perceive, and interact with the world. And then the third example of just environmental is I had a traumatic brain injury, which they're still conducting research on, but impacted my brain structure, and likely those electrical signals, chemical signals, are really those neural pathways and roadways of how my brain communicates and processes information. So I wanted to give some examples of some different neurodivergences and how they make me who I am and how I operate. I find this statistic fascinating for many reasons. In 2022, the NIH published the statistic that an estimated 15 to 20% of the world's population exhibits some form of neurodivergence. So that's essentially 1 in 5 human beings having a neurodivergence, whether they are aware of it or not, which speaks to how we are continually learning and unlocking labels to better understand what they are, how they manifest, and what have we not yet discovered about these different ways of operating. And I think this statistic is an amazing point of conversation. Do you think this statistic is low? Do you think this statistic is high? How might we bring in conversations around access and equity? And so I would like to offer this as a possible takeaway of just some future conversations that you might hold with others to welcome them into this conversation. So let's get into some collaboration and partnership strategies. This was taken from a study done in 2018, and really what was the main takeaway from this article was one of the greatest indicators of student success is not only the influence of a teacher, but the successful partnership between families and schools and how it can substantially improve student success both inside and outside of the school context. So I'm gonna start us off with something different this time. And I wanted to have us use a rock climbing analogy. I myself have never climbed a natural rock. I have attempted rock climbing in some of the gyms with the colorful knobs. But I honestly, this is just more aesthetically pleasing for a webinar. So I chose the natural route. And what I'd like for you to think about, whether or not you've ever been rock climbing, if we were to see this individual here at the bottom, we also can see on the very bottom right, the top of somebody else's head. And that's important because I wanted it to be representative of 2 individuals being there. And I want you to think about if you were standing at the bottom of this, the rock face, what might you need in addition to that safety rope? What might you need to ascend or climb that mountain? You can take a moment to think about it. You're welcome to put some items in the chat. But what might you need to get up this mountain? Ooh, to know that it's possible. I lied. I went back to the chat. Yes, knowledge, training, skills. Yes, skills and the support from someone. Absolutely. Putting aside fears. Whew, that's huge. Encouragement. Yes. Someone at the top giving help and guidance. Absolutely. These are all great. And I cannot wait to, after the webinar, to be able to go back and really read this input. And so when I had asked some parents the same question in preparation for today, some of the terms you can see on the right side of the screen, which I saw reflected in our chat here this morning: encourage, communication, trying it out, or knowing really that you can try it out with it being okay to fail because you have that safety rope with you and someone to catch you. Being able to listen to that other individual that's guiding you and that collaboration and partnership, brainstorming, coming up with new ideas. What did you try is not really working out, and how might you come up with a new plan of maybe a new path to go up the mountain? And that sharing of information, and really at the root of it, is trust of that other individual that they are going to have your back. And I'd like for us to kind of start to associate these two individuals, the individual on the left, the rock climber, as the student, and the other individual there, the support system, as that parent, family, or caregiver. And so if we start to look at these two individuals as the student and parent and caregiver, and we start to imagine this mountain as the high school journey, it looks really daunting when you first start out. It can often be overwhelming, and it's oftentimes, well, especially for students, but for some families, if you have not yet had a student that has gone through the high school experience, this is a brand new mountain for you to climb. And so that the reiterating that importance of that trust and that communication with one another is really important, and trying to help guide the student. How are we guiding the student up this rock? It's the student who is the one that is climbing. And so how can we build their skill set and their confidence and their sense of identity that they can do this to ascend and climb up the rock? On the flip side, this is a view of the mountaintop, of the mountain from the top. And what we can see right away is that this is a very different viewpoint, a very different perspective. So what this individual can see from the top, they might be able to see different points where the rock juts out, or different points where the rock actually looks really unstable, that those on the bottom are not able to see because of their perspective. And so what if we looked at this other perspective as the teacher or school? Both individuals, both the family and the teacher or school, are working together with the joint mission of successfully supporting this student to get up the mountain, and to really do it independently while having scaffolds and supports. But how can we combine, or how can we communicate around these two very different perspectives in order to ultimately reach the success of the student? So we're really kind of thinking now of that family and school partnership, less of two entities partnering together, but more of that coach and that guide for the student. How are our two coaches and or our two guides coming together to collaborate and communicate so that the student is successful in how they ascend or climb this mountain face? So, like I just said, how can we reframe these two different perspectives and this partnership? And so we want to apply this now to the school context. We're taking those same exact premises that we named of building trust, giving encouragement, brainstorming as thought partners. Here's what I see from my perspective or my purview. Here's what you see, and how can we kind of come together to create the best plan with our student, not for our student, but with our student, who's the one that's climbing. And if either the student finds that something's not working, then how can we adjust our approach and best support them as the climber? I just realized in this moment, these are 8 ways to partner and collaborate with high schools. I apologize for that text mishap. So we're going to look at some around 8 different strategies that you might try to best partner and collaborate with your student in their high school, with this school and your student in this high school journey. So our first strategy was that perspective taking. How can we come together and join our perspectives in order to best support the student? Our second strategy is who might be that climbing staff at the school. Moving from middle school to high school is there are a lot more people, and there is the building is also greatly larger most of the time. And so here are some individuals that might be available to best support and get to know your student, including the teachers, which students are going to have sometimes 7+ teachers. They might have repeats, but 7+ teachers, their counselor, instructional assistants if they are receiving specialized services, or really any staff member who's making a connection with their student. If you'd like to find more information about who those individuals might be, I highly recommend that you utilize the school's website and or the school's social media. The school's website contains contact information for all staff members, not only for the departments in which they are in, but also for those clubs or sports teams of who you can reach out to create those relationships. So now that we have an idea of who might be on our students' coaching or guide staff, in addition to our teachers, how can we utilize it? What might we be able to do with it to help best support our student success? And so we have here the first steps of a coaching roster, which is our third strategy. And so in order to utilize our staff, we have to know who they are, where they are, and how to communicate with them. And so, to be honest, getting there is half the battle. So I broke this up into steps. So first, we have to know what the student's day looks like. What time are their courses, which correlates to their teacher? In what order does it take place? Might that have an impact on our students' functioning? And how can we utilize the school's website and resources? So in order to create this student profile that I'm going to share with you, I went to the school's website and I went to the About section and I opened up the bell schedule, because each high school might have a different structure for their bell schedule. It's likely going to be a block schedule, which for many middle schoolers could be a different format, going from 45 minutes to now a 90-minute block. And so if you have any questions as well about what is the structure of the scheduling, what might the mascot time entail, to get better answers for this, I actually called the main office and they were able to provide me with all the information that I needed to create this student schedule. So here we have just a blank template, and I created a student schedule as a tool for the student. And so this is just an example of what it might look like. So you may have noticed that I rearranged the block numbers so that it correlates with the days in which the student will be having that experience. So for example, the odd numbers are on one day and the even numbers are on the other day. And the rest of this roster will be filled out with the more information you gather as it relates to whether when teachers are available to meet, or through a syllabus, or through your relationship with them, and through the student's relationship with their teacher and support staff. So like I said, having now 90 minutes for each class block is a really great point of discussion with your student. This is 90 minutes of regulating the individual's maybe emotions, processing, planning, which are all skill building. So something that I learned in my teaching experience was that just because a student had access to an accommodation does not necessarily mean that they knew how or why to utilize their accommodation. So if it were, when it's offered, to really build the skill of using the accommodation in addition to them having access for it, because sometimes that is where the missing link is I can present a student with a tool all day, and unless I build the skills for them to independently utilize that skill, it's always going to fall short. And so we're going to talk about some of those strategies more explicitly when we get to strategy 6. And depending on the way in which your student functions, you might be able to use this as a tool to see trends during the time of day, whether or not energy is expended more in certain parts of the day, if there's a topic that is maybe not their favorite, how might it impact their transition into the next class period? And is that a conversation you can have? So for example, if I had a student and they despised English 9 for whatever reason it might be, and I knew that that deeply impacted possibly their anxiety and or their ability to kind of be present in school, I might have a conversation with this Algebra 1 teacher, Brown, to let them know, hey, here's something you might be observing, and here's the why. So it's really a tool that you can use in a variety of ways to support your student, and writing down the locker information of where to find it, how to utilize it. But your student might benefit from using this for at least the first month of school to know where they're going and when they're going there. So now that we know what our schedule is and where we're going, we now have to scout the layout, because moving from middle school to high school, we often have a much larger building, and it can often feel like a maze. So what we can do is we can take our, excuse me, we can take our coaching roster and utilize that to scout the field. So this new arena might be a big transition, like I said, from middle school to high school. There are 2 floors. Is it feeling like a maze? How do I really understand my bearings? So some things we can do is you can walk through the building ahead of time according to the days. So for this example, all of our odd days are in the blue numbers. So how might I support my student in walking from class to class to familiarize themselves with the route? In addition to, do I need to utilize my locker at this space? Even practicing with a gym locker, sometimes those locks are not the easiest things to work with. And so how might you provide opportunities to practice? You can take pictures to visualize, so that when you're at home, maybe you refer to those visualizations to really work with that processing. Checking out the cafeteria, might that be a place for overstimulation? Can you contact your school, whether the counselor or the assistant principal, ahead of time to arrange for an alternate lunch location? Where is the main office and the student's counselor? Is there a process for seeing your counselor? Do you have to sign up? Just kind of getting aware and comfortable with practicing those different processes. There's also likely going to be a lot more students in the hallway. And so hallways and crowds are likely going to look very different. And so some things you might be able to do are either connect with somebody who is a current high school student, or maybe if you can visit that school during a transition time to really understand what that crowding might look like and enable your student to really learn their space. So another tool from our playbook is the strengths, interests, and look-fors. And so we use this tool in elementary school webinar and the middle school webinar with a hope that this could be really transferred along a student's journey and capturing their strengths, the progress that they've made, interests, and what might be some support look-fors for the teachers to be aware of. And this can support grade to grade transition, but also as a tool to support the 7 possibly plus teachers that a student is interacting with. And so here's an example of what this tool might look like. It could be bullet points, it could be sentences, it could be drawings, however your student best represents their own individual thinking. And so this can be an activity that you do with your student to support the conversation and thinking and learn together, or maybe the student might like to do this independently. And so what you can do is share this tool with the school so that, like I said, they can learn best about the student's strengths, abilities, and how the environment might need to be adapted to support their success. And so it can be used as a conversation starter with teachers to share that information and how to best create a sense of belonging in those opportunities for success. While the teacher, through time and experience with the student, will hopefully acquire this information naturally, they might not know this information otherwise, depending on the class size or the different conditions that exist in the class. Or it might not happen until later in the year. So how can we name, nurture, and expose our teachers to these interests and strengths from the get-go? And one quote I love from a neurodivergent author, Thomas Armstrong, is, "It's not how smart you are, it's how you're smart." And so how can we illuminate that for teachers? And how can we name those strengths for our teaching staff? So as an example, I wrote this as myself in ninth grade. And a caveat is that at the time, I did not know I had ADHD. And so I did this. I actually called my parents to corroborate like my recollection of my experience with theirs. And it really turned into an interesting conversation. And to be honest, likely one that would have probably looked different with high school Kristen, because I had not yet developed my growing self-awareness or my interoception, my ability to really recognize and understand what is my body telling me or how am I operating. But it was an interesting conversation with my parents. And not only might this help inform what courses a student might take, because there's a lot more courses to choose from in high school, but really thinking about some of these support look-fors to better understand what is the student experiencing and how might responses be better tailored to their support. So how can we create a culture where we are unlocking labels? How might a different way of operating manifest for that individual? Labels are important as a starting point to help our brains process information. But when we take those labels for their face value and don't question any possible stereotypes or biases that might come in and not see and affirm the individual, this is where a lot of the harm can take place. So for an example, a parent recently shared with me that when their autistic son is experiencing anxiety, it might present as aggression. And so how can we support that perspective taking to see the anxiety and ground that support in whether it's re-regulation or some coping strategies, rather than misinterpreting that behavior for aggression and acting as such, or acting upon it, the support as such. And so this also really serves as an important why behind accommodations and or the need for environmental adaptations as a talking point with teachers. So we have not yet created a system for our teachers and support staff to truly connect and understand the why behind the supports that are necessary and required for students to be successful. So reframing it as it's not because they're not able to do XYZ, it's often because they cannot do it in the one way that's either forced by the system, like assessments, or our public education culture, like sitting in rows for 90 minutes. And so an example of how to use this as connecting this tool to connecting to the why is if I were to use this today in my coursework, which I did, I used a variation of this But I use this tool as a way to have a conversation with my professor ahead of the class. I now know that I have to have access to notes ahead of time. Otherwise, my brain is it really struggles to hold information from the slide while I'm processing and taking notes and listening to my instructor. And so I either have the opportunity to print the notes ahead of time, or I have found that, and I'm not suggesting that your kids need iPads, but I have an iPad so I can take a photo of the slide and I write my notes directly on it, which is the same thing as paper and pencil. But just to give a real world application and context to how this tool might be used. So, strategy 6, building this bag of tools for our students. Excuse me. So here we have our climber, which is representative of our student. And while you can't see it in the picture, there will be a safety rope for that student to use to climb, which is supported by not only the family, but also by the teacher in the school at the top. And so how are we in high school? How are we building our students' skill sets to move them along the continuum towards independence? Because that's what we ultimately hope for our students is once they graduate, is that they have a sense and ability for independence, where they're no longer as reliant on any other individual for their functioning. And I say that not as a whole generalization. I know that there are very different needs and levels of support that students require, and I don't want to I do not want to negate that. So how can we empower and build skills within our students to utilize their tools so that they are able to best operate and function? And so how can we build executive functioning skills? Executive functioning skills are not innate to human beings, meaning we're not born with executive functioning skills. They're developed over time. Oftentimes at this age, they're still in the developing phase. A neurotypical individual is still in the developing phase of strengthening executive functioning skills. And within that, neurodivergence, there's likely some different routes we have to take to build those executive functioning skills to support their different ways of thinking, learning, and processing. And so how can we do that? In order to best build new skills, we have to support the student in creating their own new connections. And how we do that is that we have to create real world relevance and application, repeated opportunities for practice, and finding a system that works for your student. So like I said before, in a previous strategy where we can give the students the tools, and until we build their skill in utilizing that tool, that's where the difference is made. And so when I was in the classroom, I quickly realized that if a student required more support in building that executive functioning skill, a digital planner app in their phone might work for one student, and writing it in a planner that has their favorite soccer player on the top is what's going to work for another student. And so how can we connect to why is this skill important, not only in the school context, but how it's going to help them in everyday life? And how can we give them repeated opportunities for practice? So for example, I was given every single planner to-do list when I was in high school, and I never really understood the importance, the utility of it, and really how to use and manage it. And so I had to find my own system for creating those lists or creating those planning documents that worked for me, and had to continually practice them with the encouragement of my support system. And sometimes that included falling down the rock a little bit. it wasn't always that someone was there to catch me. Sometimes I needed to learn that this did not work, or I needed to keep up with this and fall down the rock a little bit to find a new path of building that skill that worked for me. And so what we're really doing is we're creating in the brain, the neurons, with repeated opportunities for practice, real world relevance and experience, and multimodal opportunities through all of our senses. We're able to create new connections with our neurons. And so the more and more we practice, the stronger that they get, and we can then do things with automaticity. This same premise is for building communication skills within our students. So something that is a huge transition from middle school to high school is that a lot of teachers you might hear saying, I need to hear from the student. And that is with the intention of wanting to build those skills with and for that student. And so how might we create those same systems of repeated opportunities for practice, creating new connections, and real world application to creating those or building those communication skills? So an example being in a class I had that I was teaching in high school, I had made a horrible assumption that students knew how to write an email to their teachers. And it's likely because it's something that I did every day. I assumed that kids were on their phones all the time or computers all the time. And so I thought, naturally, they must know how to write an email. Completely false. So breaking down the steps, let me take that back. Some might, absolutely. And I made the incorrect assumption that it was a skill that all students by 9th grade had. That was completely false. And so what I had to do was break down the steps of even finding, where can I find this teacher's email? How do I write an email? And how do I continually monitor for that correspondence so that I can see their response and follow up on either whether it's a task or an expectation? So there's a lot of layers to even writing and responding to an email that not only will support their communication with their teachers, whether it's about a homework assignment or going to advisory time to get a pass, but it also has that real world relevance of outside of high school. How are we building those skills so that they're able to communicate in, quote, the real world? And we spoke about these accommodations, how to use the tool. If your student has access to accommodations, some conversations that I'm having now with some schools or with teachers and with some of our central office partners is, how are we closing that loop between the accommodation and why the accommodation is needed? And so for an example, if a student might require an accommodation for frequent breaks, not only building that loop between the student for understanding, I'm going to go back to that example that I had given previously about the student with anxiety. And so let's say a student who experiences heightened amounts of anxiety and really requires a break to re-regulate in order to re-access the classroom and education. Taking a break is not the same as taking a break to meet your needs. And so when the student takes the break, how are we supporting them in identifying what works best for them? Not, when you go out and take a break, you're going to take breaths and you're going to name 5 things you see. That might work, but what is it from the student's perspective that really supports their re-regulation? Maybe it is closing their eyes for 5 seconds and doing square breathing. I just say all of that to say, how can we connect the accommodation with the why and the practice, not only for the student, but to build understanding with the school as well? That this accommodation is required and necessary for my student to be able to function best and access their education because XYZ. What would be amazing is if by the time they are seniors, if we are able to continue to build these communication skills and self-advocacy skills, that they themselves are able to communicate what their needs are, the why, and the how they either are going to independently address those needs or what support might they need. That would be ideal. And I say that because oftentimes I'm thinking of like my own experience, and a lot of times masking was involved, which is a way to hide the actual needs to kind of cope with the social environment and or try to maintain until I could get to what was perceived as a safe place to really allow myself to express and function in the way that I needed to. So I say that as a hope. How can we build these skills within our students so that by the time that they are moving through the high school system, that they are maybe requiring less and less scaffolding. And I have to imagine that's scary, being the other individual next to this student as the parent or the family or the caregiver, and you're holding on to this rope and you're seeing your student going up this mountain. I have to imagine that that is scary. And the last bullet point is so important. How are we transferring through scaffolds, including that emotional support and encouragement? How are we transferring the ownership of these skills so that they are able to move towards independence? And you will always be there with the rope, it's supporting them. It's just that how are they able to climb up that mountain independently and to see themselves as you see them for all of their amazing strengths and abilities, and to really step into that for themselves. The seventh strategy is how to incorporate warm-up meetings and timeouts. So let's say your student is climbing the rock and you're noticing that you and your student are noticing that something about this approach is just not working, or we see another path. How might you utilize warm-up meetings and timeouts as a way to enhance your partnership and collaboration with the school? And so in that beginning of the year, how might you use those tools that we discussed to have conversations around those strengths and interests and look-fors to best prepare these two perspectives to come together and support the student? Maybe you need a timeout during the year. And so how might you recognize that a different path might need to be taken? Let's say going back to that example I gave with English 9, and the student really just not liking English 9. And so how might, if with giving with your student the different tools and strategies, and that path is just not quite working, maybe you call a timeout and ask to connect with the teacher and the student and re-strategize and problem solve and collect what is your perspective on this situation? What is your perspective on this situation? All the while allowing that student to lead and drive that conversation. Because when it comes to this entire process, their perspective is what always needs to be centered. We can also look at it as a proactive sense of communication. How are we putting in, sometimes we call relationships like a banking system. How are we communicating not always just on maybe what's not working well, but what is working well? How can we put positive attributes into the relationship so that we're being built on the whole student? And when some of those harder conversations have to take place, we have built a positive rapport or relationship. So when those harder conversations have to take place, we've created structures so that it can happen and in a way that's productive. And again, transferring that ownership of these skills and communications to the students with scaffolds? How are we centering them in this work, in this journey, in this conversation to be the ones leading the efforts as they're the ones climbing the mountain? And last but not least, how can we utilize extracurriculars? High school is an amazing place for clubs, sports, and other organizations. And why I feel so strongly about that is because of my experience as a high school teacher, getting involved as being a club sponsor, an organization sponsor, and a coach. They are spaces outside of the public education structure that is not built for all students. And so how can we tap into those clubs, organizations, and other supports to really affirm and support our students in their interests and their sense of belonging? That, I think, is the most powerful aspect of these different structures, is to create a community for these students, whatever their interests are, to feel seen and a place of belonging, and that they have a community to connect with. So to learn more about what might be available, if you go to your school's website and go to the full menu, there is a tab of student life and activities, which lists all of the different organizations and clubs. I haven't, to be honest, obviously I have not checked every single high school's website, but generally speaking, if you go to the full menu, student life activities, there is a tab for clubs and organizations. And oftentimes there's a list of all of the clubs and organizations that currently exist, and or contact information about who you can speak to, most likely in the activities office, with more information. Excuse me. If there is not a club or an organization that meets your students' interests, there's often opportunities to create their own club and organization. And that's incredibly exciting. And I also want to share the caveat that some schools have a process of how to, all the different things that are needed in order for that student to create this new club and organization. And it often involves multiple steps. So I go back to that idea of building the student's toolbox and scaffolding with support, because that might be a very layered process that they might require some support in organizing and planning and executing that task, not because they're not able to, but because of the layers that are involved and how we're continually building their executive functioning skills. And last but not least here, most high schools have a website dedicated to their sports or athletics, and there's important information that is released there. So for example, this is a good time to start thinking about if you have a student who might be interested in trying out for a fall sport, which often tryouts start sometimes in July. There is required paperwork in order for that student to even be able to try out, as it relates to kind of some medical forms and permission forms. And so I highly recommend that you go to your high school's website and check out their athletics page to see any announcements or required documentation that's required for your student to even engage in the first tryout or practice. And so we just went through 8, not 6, 8 ways to partner and collaborate with high schools all around your students' success and for them to thrive in the high school environment. And so what I often always kind of come back to is the flower quote and analogy. And so if we were to see that this plant has not yet grown into, let's say, a tomato plant here, we would never question that this plant does not know how to grow into a tomato plant. We would never clip it. We would never ask it to change or say that it's not able to, we would always first go to the environment. What around their environment is not enabling them to thrive? Is it the soil? Is it the amount of water? Is it the exposure to sunlight? Maybe they haven't been exposed to any sunlight. So, what assumptions might we be making about this plant versus the environment? And so, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And so, what tools can we use to build and cultivate this flower so that it can reach its potential? That might also include adapting the environment to best meet their needs. And so, what if in Fairfax County Public Schools, we treated each student as that flower? We nurtured, affirmed, and adapt their environment to meet their needs while providing them with the skills and the tools necessary to, to enable them to access not only what they need to, but what they want to and what they have interests in. And so I thank you so much for your time with me in this webinar this morning. And I look forward to reading the chat and some of the questions that you have. And so thank you for joining this conversation as we are working towards a neurodiversity affirming Fairfax County Public Schools.
Kristen, excuse me, Kristen, thank you so much. And as always, I really appreciated your strategies, and having been a former high school administrator and teacher, you know, I so appreciate strategies for families, but also again with the idea that we are partners, and that's really important. So we have a few questions starting up in the chat. And so I would like, if you all have any questions, please put them in, and we will get to them. So the first question kind of refers to accommodations, Kristen. And so a parent is saying, I find schools ready to accommodate like seating, fidgets, test time changes, but not changes to curriculum. What can we do when the most advanced curriculum offered does not meet a student's needs? How can parents communicate accommodations and modifications which will get ahead of behavior issues without making the behavior be in place before offering those accommodations and modifications? So a couple of different questions there.
I just want to paraphrase. I also wrote down in case I make sure I captured it all. So essentially, if outside of some of the accommodations that you named, how might families support the looking more closely at curriculum, especially more advanced curriculum that the student is able to access? Or can you rephrase the question?
No, I think you have that part. And then just maybe how families could help better communicate their idea of kind of some best practices around some of those accommodations and modifications before behaviors, get to a point where then, it's kind of being proactive as opposed to reactive.
I think that's a really great question. And I think it comes back to our teachers and our support staff I'm always reminded of my time in the classroom and when I'm visiting schools now, and always reminded of the grace that's required of our teachers, of all that they are taking on to support our students in all of these different facets. And with that, there's a lot of learning that our teachers have not yet had access to, and that includes administrators as well. And I think of that in terms of a lot of the pre-service training that's available, or even professional development, we do not yet really address the why. So when it comes to being proactive and kind of utilizing those tools that are available to help your student thrive and not, as was said, kind of turn into some behaviors that are still ways of communicating, needing support, or that their needs are not yet being met, is a way to help the teacher or administrator understand how your student functions. And so what I mean by that is when, and I don't know if this is a like a aligned example, but I'm thinking of, I was in a school recently and there was a student who and it was an elementary school, and a student would stand up and sing the chorus of the Circle of Life. And the teacher's perception of what that was disruption and trying to avoid XYZ, whatever it might be. And what actually was taking place was that student was scripting and an attempt to communicate that the Circle of Life represented a very exciting and passionate moment for that student, which related to the topic to which they were discussing. And that connection is not going to be innate for our teachers. So I hope that was an example that might illustrate helping our teachers to build those skills of being the detective and not the judge, because that's a skill that we have to build in the moment, being able to think, what is being communicated right now and how is my response grounded in their support, and being able to kind of not take into context everything else that's taking place rather than reacting as more of a judge. And that's a skill that we need to cultivate, not only in our teachers, but in our society in general, is to see and affirm others for their means of communication as valuable and correct. And so I think what it really comes down to is just those deeper conversations around the purpose and the function of the why. And I'm not, I didn't write down the rest of the question, so I definitely could have gone off course there. So please reframe the question for me if I did not address it.
No, I think, Kristen, I think that was a great kind of response, at least certainly philosophically, where your office is coming from. And to take that just a little bit further, and I know, and this is something I know you get asked every time we have one of these webinars, is really around just maybe helping to highlight some of the potential professional development that you foresee school staff engaging in moving forward as you continue your work with schools.
I love that question. Something that I foresee that is different from what I have currently been doing is professional development with both general education and special education teachers and our administrators to really make to address mindsets to connect to method. What I mean by that is we are shifting from a deficit-laden system, a pathologizing system, into this neurodiversity affirming system where we're strength-based and we're seeing that label that student might hold as one part of who they are and how they function. And I think where that leap needs to take place is that we have to have, for students to have access to services in public schools, there has to be a diagnosis. And so where our fault has been is that we sit in that diagnosis for to represent that entire, let's say, neurodivergence, if it is a neurodivergence, and we don't automatically make the connection to, so how does this impact this individual's functioning? What barriers does the educational system place that prevent that student from accessing, not because the student isn't able to, but in this environment and in this structure, this is a barrier that we need to address and remove because the student is capable and competent. And I think that is the transition that I desperately and am excited to support within that mindset and that culture. Is so if we understand how students operate differently, how are we continuing to unlock that label and move out of this deficit system to see the whole individual? And my goal is to work on professional development and structures that enable that mindset to take place so that the school itself or the school as a system or the procedures, that those are not barriers, that we are removing that the individuals, that we ourselves are no longer barriers to students, and that we're looking at it from that neurodiversity affirming perspective.
Kristen, thank you for highlighting that, because I know families are often curious, that they want to engage, but what then are schools doing to kind of improve their knowledge and understanding? So thank you for that. I'm going to just take a question that a parent is asking and kind of condense it a little bit, because I want to be mindful of our time and making sure that we get all our questions in today. But this parent is very concerned about starting a conversation with her school's IEP team about her son taking advanced courses, and perhaps taking them in a different order just based on his current development and functioning. Like, that's just one piece, but what suggestions might you have around some kind of conversation starters with a school's IEP team around kind of thinking differently, around kind of course identification, course enrollment, especially for our 2E students, and needing those advanced courses. Just an idea of just a couple ideas that how parents could start those conversations, I think would be helpful.
That's a great question. Some things that immediately come to mind is asking for a meeting, whether it's a timeout meeting or a beginning of the year meeting, or a meeting now, because I know a lot of course scheduling is taking place with multiple people from that student's team. So for example, if they have a case manager, the counselor is going to be incredibly important. Maybe someone from administration or a department chair. How can you pull together those different stakeholders or roles within the school who have access to different pieces of information? And when that meeting takes place, how can you lead the conversation and start with the strengths? Because the strengths and the abilities of the student are the justification as to why that student requires access to XYZ courses. And from there, in reframing that conversation, I'm wondering how it might go differently. And I think that there are still a lot of misconceptions within our system about what students are, quote, able to access versus not able to access. And so oftentimes our students in their schedules are asked to morph into, the schedules are shaped to fit into the school's structure, rather than the student having access to the courses that they require and the school making adaptations to allow that student to have access. And so that is a huge conversation that is currently taking place, is how are students being held back from entering XYZ courses because of either a misconception that they cannot be supported in that course, and or what maybe the state requirements are for course completion. And so that's why it's so important to have not only the case manager, but the counselor there as well, and possibly another individual from the leadership team to just engage in that conversation, starting with the strengths.
No, thank you. And to follow up a little bit, Kristen, can you talk about the partnership that you have with our new 2E specialist in the county, and how your partnership, the partnership between both of your offices may help to kind of start to bridge some of these concerns that families are having around access to advanced academics for their students who may need some types of support?
It's a great question. So while our 2E specialist and I, we function in different offices, and the nature of our work is different. We do collaborate regularly on, excuse me, what are the current experiences of our students and families, so that we are in a common understanding of what is currently taking place, so that when we are in spaces and can advocate and share this real data of what is currently existing, that we are able to bring that forth to members of leadership and to address these inequities. We also collaborate on ensuring that we are using common language and understanding, and just kind of making sure that we're staying connected so that we're calibrated in what we're doing, and to really support one another and kind of what are the barriers that we are seeing in schools that we might not have yet seen, so that we can also illuminate those as well.
No, thank you. And I just did put in the chat that the Family Resource Center, we're working with the 2E specialist to bring a series of webinars next school year for families. So please stay tuned for that. And I did want to put a little shout out to our office is actually offering a cohort for school teams and once the school year is over, to talk about family engagement and best practices around partnering with families. And so, again, I think we're trying to build capacity of schools in order to establish partnerships, and in turn having very open and honest conversations around individual students, and making sure that we are bridging all those communication maybe obstacles sometimes, and making sure that then we're fully supporting the success of all of our students. So often like to share that information with you all, because we are working on professional development and supporting schools, and kind of rethinking, as Kristen, you very graciously talked about reframing and talking about different mindset. And so that is something we are really very hopeful about, and working with schools and doing this professional development. All right, are there any other questions? And I'm sorry if I missed your question. All of you, and Kristen will be very interested in, and I will share the chat comments with her, so she'll be able to see your feedback and just statements. So please know that she will see those. And someone did ask about the previously recorded webinars. Those are on our YouTube channel. And thank you, Sade, who's one of our liaisons here, just put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat box. So without any further questions, Kristen, thank you so very much today for being with us. And this finishes our series with Kristen, but that for this year, that doesn't mean we're not going to invite her back and to do some more specialized webinars for us in the future. And certainly, if you all have any comments or any feedback around webinars around neurodiversity that you would like to see us do, please do let us know. And we already have a comment in the box. Come back, Kristen. This was great. So we really appreciate that. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We wish you a pleasant day and weekend and look forward to working with you all in the future. So thanks again, everyone, and take care.